Greetings, everyone. I am Syed Ali Jafri, and I welcome you to another episode of the CISPA webinar series, which aims to bring to you nuanced discussions on a very security and strategic issues. Since time immemorial, actors, regardless of the type of systems they find themselves in, have tried to coerce their enemies into submission. Coercion, which includes both deterrence and compellence, seeks to change an adversary's behavior to one's own advantage. While one might assume that states possessing more military strength can successfully coerce militarily weaker states, the literature tells us a different story. Military might does not guarantee successful coercion. This is especially true apropos of compellence. There are several reasons why superior firepower does not always have the desired compellent effects. First, the magnitude of the coercer's demand is too great. In other words, the coercer wants the target to make more concessions than it can. Second, as successful compellence requires the target to take an action or reverse an ongoing one, it is unlikely to give in out of fear of suffering reputational damage. Third, targets think that if they agree to one demand, coercers will become emboldened and will increase their demands. Fourth, and perhaps the most important for scholars of coercion, coercion fails because threats lack credibility and severity. um, Dr. Reid Pauly's new book, The Art of Coercion, Credible Threats, and the Assurance Dilemma, critiques the scholarly focus on threat credibility and severity and establishes a strong connection between coercive outcomes and a new paradigm, which is the coercive dilemma. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by the author himself. Some words about the author. Reid Pauly is Assistant Professor of Political Science and the Dean's Assistant Professor of Nuclear Security and Policy at Brown University's Watson School of International and Public Affairs. He studies nuclear proliferation, nuclear strategy, and coercion in international politics. His scholarship has also been published in International Security, International Studies Quarterly, the European Journal of International Relations, and Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. You've written a very timely book which tells us one of the axioms of global politics, which is that coercion has failed more often than it has succeeded. And there's an impressive scholarship on why coercion has failed. So I want in my as a first question, I want to ask you as to why you decided to focus A on compellence and B because most of the scholarly literature is focused on deterrence, but compellence has always been understudied, despite the fact that its founder Thomas Schelling back in 1966 said that compellence is harder than deterrence. So tell us, why did you focus on compellence, and then we'll begin talking about the assurance dilemma. Thank you so much.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Ali. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm excited to share this book with your readers. I'll also just highlight that there's a new foreign affairs article out I wrote with Matthew Siebel, came out last week, that applies the book to the second Trump administration, modern policy problems, not only Iran, but of course Iran. So this is an issue that is very much on the minds of scholars, analysts, and policymakers, people who are grappling with a current and ongoing coercive failure, and thinking about how, what policies, what tools we have at our disposal to break through this bargaining failure and lead to some successful negotiated outcome here. I think that's where I begin in terms of the motivation, Ali, is that there is a sort of a peace principle at the core of studying compellence uh, and deterrence, but coercion more broadly. This is the study of negotiation and bargaining. Uh, it begins a bit, if there's a peace principle at the core, it begins a bit from the premise that is a bit pessimistic, fair enough, but a bit pessimistic, the premise that there will always be disputes between governments. that there will be disagreements, sometimes very severe disagreements over high stakes issues that governments need to resolve or believe. We'll have leaders, in those governments that believe that those disputes need to be resolved, and that they will make threats about what they are willing to do to try and resolve them in their favor violently. If we understood better how that communication can happen before violence begins, then we can prevent the violence from happening. That's the kind of scholarly peace principle at the heart of why we study bargaining, negotiation, coercion, and then specifically you asked about compellence, because we can look at international politics and history and see that these disputes are going to continue to come up. And so the path towards reducing violence in a world that is far too violent is to understand how to communicate better about where our red lines are, what we are in fact resolved over, what we are willing to do over what stakes, and therefore how to negotiate before violence begins. Specifically to your question on compellence, this is what we can observe better. So scholars have begun to focus on it more because we have some data from history about when one government threatens another and asks it to change its behavior. So compellence seeks a change in the status quo, deterrence seeks to preserve a status quo. When deterrence succeeds, nothing has happened. For deterrence to work, I just get you to sit on your hands and do nothing. But when compellence works, you actually have to take an action that I have convinced you to take, and so we can see it happen. I think that everything in the book applies both to compellence and deterrence, two types of coercion. But it makes sense as a scholar to use as a test bed for our theories of negotiation, the things that we can observe in history. And that's why I focused on nuclear counterproliferation, that is compellence to try and either stop or roll back or change the nuclear program of another country.
Thank you. I think this is just a good foundation for our interesting discussion. So the scholarly literature, as you rightly mentioned in your book, focuses more on threats. Like the threats need to be managed and arranged in a way that credibly compel the target to give in. Uh, but and in your book, you specifically mentioned that all those centered academic works assume that the greater the credibility, the higher the coercive assurance will be. So the automaticity is established in that scholarly literature, but you are targeting that logic. You're saying that logic is flawed. If I were to directly quote you, you're saying that um, the
Mhm.
the more credible your threat or severe your threat is, the less credible your coercive assurance is. So this is the concept that lies at the heart of your book, the coercive dilemma. So please explain that to our viewers and then.
Absolutely. The history of coercion is littered with failures. It is a practice that works only about a third of the time. When scholars count, compelling threats, we see that it is mostly unsuccessful. And that when you are the stronger party, this is the work of Todd Sexer that I'm citing here. When you are the stronger party, as in if you are the coercer and you spend more money, the way we just measure it as scholars would be, if you spend more money on defense than the state that you're targeting, uh, then your threats work even less of the time. They work 36% of the time. Um, and if, depending on how scholars have counted, American threats, the country that we think of as being preponderant in the international system for a lot of the history that we're studying. It was the global hegemon. And so our intuitions lead us to believe that its threats would be successful because it wouldn't be likely to make highly credible and severe threats. But that's in fact not the case. Depending on how you count, the United States has succeeded in compellence somewhere between 19 and 31% of the time. It isn't just sufficient to make credible and severe threats, but these intuitions are pretty strong, both in the paradigm of scholarship that studies how to make threats credible, and also in policy. So policymakers are often thinking about, if only they didn't think we were bluffing, if only we can squeeze them a little bit harder, their surrender or their acquiescence is right around the corner. So we can't give in, we have to keep threatening and try and squeeze a little bit harder. This government, often thinks about it. I like to think in terms of the logic of we'll make them an offer they cannot refuse, right? Then coercion will work when we make them an offer that they cannot refuse. It turns out that that's only one half of the story. The book is not saying that it's not important to make credible or severe threats. That logic is actually sound if you add to it what we all know to be logical and that Thomas Schelling said in his original formulation, that threats have to be avoidable. So a target is going to evaluate the threat that you make against it according to at least two criteria. One is, do they mean what they say, and are they going to hurt me if I don't comply? That's the threat credibility. But the other is, do they mean to hurt me anyway? If I actually give in, am I likely to avoid the threatened punishment? And these two things are evaluated separately. So you could decide that, yes, the threat is credible and it is severe and it is punishment I wish to avoid, but I have decided that the assurance is not credible and therefore the pain is unavoidable. And so I defy the threat, but not because I didn't think the threat was credible. And we see that a lot. The book tracks lots of cases in which that is the reason why target leaders have decided to defy credible and severe threats. And it's a real tragedy because it means that there is a fundamental communication failure happening between the governments. And I think it is an aspect of what is going on today between the United States and Iran.
I think, based on what you said, I think the target state should perceive that there are some perks to acquiescence. So when the target state does not see any incentives to stand down, it says that I might as well do it. I might as well, because damned if you do, damned if you don't. So if
Yeah.
this is exactly what you're saying, that if if a target state thinks that we will be punished regardless of what we do, then we might as well show defiance and deny uh, any space to the coercer, come what may. And this is what is exactly happening with Iran. Iran thinks, like,
Yeah. I would
currently.
just add one thing, Ali, to clarify this concept. I think you're exactly right. That the punishment must be avoidable. And there's a great quote in the book when this was happening in South Africa. The chief nuclear scientist of South Africa's nuclear program, in reflecting on the decision between whether to make concessions on the nuclear program versus go deeper and actually construct warheads. Their logic was, if I have to take the punishment, I at least want to be guilty. Which is to say, if you're going to sanction us over nuclear proliferation, uh, and in the case of South Africa, it was the fact that it was also entangled with sanctions for apartheid, which was another good reason to sanction South Africa. but became entangled in the minds of those leaders such that they thought that there was no possible world in which they could avoid the sanctions. And so, if I have to take the punishment, I at least want to be guilty, meant to them that we might as well build nuclear weapons because we're being punished for like we had them anyways. And so they did in the 1980s. I would just add, though, too, that that is about the avoidability of punishment, the avoidability of the threat. What it is not is an inducement or a carrot. So I would just keep distinct in our minds because we like to use these concepts of carrots and sticks when talking about negotiation. And, that's fine, but it's really insufficient because if you just think of the tools of statecraft as sticks and carrots, then what you've really done is paper over this separate and studyable and manipulable concept of assurance, which, if you had to use those terms, is really like the non-use of the stick or the avoidability of the stick. I'll just give you a quick example, and because we're talking, and we'll talk more about Iran. I saw in the MOU that Pakistan helped mediated, and that has now broken down as a ceasefire agreement for the war, um, that there were uh, clearly behind it threats, right, to continue the war, to go to war again, assurances that of all kinds in terms of, well, how do we know that the United States is not going to just return to war? How do we know they won't come back for us for more in the future? The assurances are also lifting of sanctions. So there's an assurance there in terms of the American threat, excuse me, the American promise to lift oil sanctions has long been not credible anymore for the Iranians, and therefore the United States was paying a kind of assurance premium in the MOU in terms of lifting the sanctions first to allow Iran to sell oil, because the promise of future lifting was not credible. So that assurance premium needed to be paid. But completely separate from that, the MOU also included carrots, these kind of vague promises of investment, right? A big reconstruction fund in the future, inducements. We just like to make a distinction. Granted, they're all kind of mixed together in one big bargaining pot. But we like to make a distinction in the study of this between the threats, the assurances, which are the flip side of those threats, and then the carrots, which are the inducements. Separate from coercion, you can also just bribe someone to do what you want, and that would be a carrot strategy rather than a sticks and carrot strategy. In any case, that's useful to keep a
Yes.
distinction in our minds.
I think since you mentioned Iran, I will fast forward my question on Iran. Uh, so Iran is currently a living example of the problems associated with the coercive dilemma. The coercive dilemma is glaringly visible in the Iran-US case, and I believe one of the sources of coercion dilemma, the dilemma, the Schoen's dilemma that you talk about, happens to be the loss of coercive control. So the
Mhm.
US has been unable to pull the plug on its ally Israel, and when the negotiations started in March, um, at the behest of Pakistan, Iran was categorically saying that we don't want a ceasefire because that ceasefire is just going to give Americans a breathing space to recuperate, so to speak, and prepare for another round of war. So it so nothing, all the carrots that, so to speak, that were being discussed, the Iranians were not believing it because, as your book highlights from the past, that the Iranians felt that we will be punished regardless, and the Americans don't have coercive control over its chief ally in the Middle East, which is Iran's nemesis, Israel. So I think this is a very important point that you make, but the problem here, what I see is that the strategies that you give to obviate the assurance dilemma, I don't think currently those strategies can really do anything, or there is any space implement those strategies, because as in the Libya case, you rightly say that at one
Mhm.
point Assurance Dilemma was not responsible for coercive failure, because regime change, the quest to change the regime, coupled with the magnitude of demands, was so overbearing that there was no bargaining space. So I think there is no bargaining space, and as you say, that when there is no bargaining space, assurance can hardly do anything. So, what's your take on the current dynamic and how that relates to the assurance dilemma? Because I think
Yeah.
currently they're really good,
Mhm.
but in the Iran, apropos of the Iran-US equation, right now I don't think there's any appetite to
Mhm.
have those strategies implemented.
Yeah, I am, let's say, as concerned as you that it is possible that that's where we are, that there is no bargaining space, and therefore strategies of assurance will be insufficient. Um, I will just, though, put it in historical context to say that right, what their chapter on Iran in the book tries to point out is that the last time there was a deal in 2015, that the important variables that shifted crucially between kind of 2012 and 2015 to get Iran to make concessions were not fundamentally about squeezing it harder and making it believe that what it thought were not credible threats were actually credible threats, and was actually shifting its thinking about it, the assurances that the United States and its partners were making, and whether it believes that there really would be sanctions relief, and an avoidance of conflict. Controlling Israel, or better to say it as sending signals to Tehran that a U.S. president, if they wanted to, could control Israel in the sense of, even though Israel is not officially party to the bargaining process, that they will not act as a spoiler to any agreement that you reach with the coalition of bargainers. That was very important last time. And I think you're right that it continues to be very important. So that's why it matters a lot, um, during the weeks of the MOU, whether the United States could deliver Israel over, say, the Lebanon issue. Um, uh, and I have watched the second Trump administration be more reactive than active. And to be fair, I'm just reading the newspaper like everybody else, but it seems to me that, especially think about it with the 12-day war, the United States was more reacting to Israeli-driven um, uh, regional policy than it was trying to um, demonstrate to others that it could, um, that if they struck a bargain with the United States, that Israel would not punish them anyway. And that is the important assurance problem, that if you are bargaining as part of any coalition, whether the other actors are at the table or not, the target is going to wonder whether in striking a bargain with you, whether they or the others are going to punish them anyway. And so it seemed to me that when President Trump, was tweeting really quite publicly, trying to rein in the Israeli Air Force at the end of the 12-day war, that those were the types of signals that you would have wanted to send prior to the war beginning, um, that would have made it more likely that we would have gotten agreement at Geneva, right, when there was ongoing bargaining. Okay, but then as you said, that yes, there is a case for complete pessimism that none of this matters anymore, at least for the foreseeable future, because the way that the United States and Israel went about starting this war sent a message that the goal of the conflict is fundamentally not about coercive bargaining. It's not about bringing pressure on this Iranian government to strike a more favorable bargain about, say, specifically the limits of its nuclear enrichment capacity. And instead, the goal of Israel and the United States was just to, by brute force, topple the government. Um, in terms of the logic of the book, uh, when that is truly the goal, if the goal and the demand is regime change, then we see failure because that demand is too high. That it is just never the case that you can get someone to commit suicide at the barrel of a gun. It's illogical, it doesn't happen. And there's also lots of other great scholarships that's pointing about how frustrating this war is because there's lots of history of how regime change never happens from the air alone. So the fact that the United States and Israel had this kind of an odd theory of victory that somehow they would drop enough bombs and not have any boots on the ground and then topple the government, it's fantastical. But it's been very tempting to lots of governments in the past. But we have lots of evidence to show that it never works. Regime change requires boots on the ground. But if then it remains the case today that that is fundamentally the goal, um, then yes, we see bargaining failure due to a magnitude of demands problem. On the other hand, what happens in the aftermath of seeking but failing to get regime change is that sometimes governments will reduce their demands and say, well, darn it, we went for regime change. Turns out it didn't work. Yes, we wish that this government didn't exist, but we are resigned to the fact that we now have to deal with it. And so we are willing to accept its, of course, continued existence as a legitimate bargaining partner. We just want to get a strict and favorable deal for our foreign policy interests. But if that's where we are now, then what we have is an assurance problem of the United States and Israel are clearly going to struggle to communicate that that is their new aim, that they aren't after regime change anymore. Then we have an assurance problem, right? So that's maybe this is frustrating too if you're just interested in policy implications, because I cannot just tell you whether we are in one world or the other. But the book can tell you that if we are in a world of really bargaining and that there is bargaining space, then there are strategies at our disposal to try and make these assurances more credible. If, however, you really just think that it is impossible, that the United States is after regime change and it won't settle for anything else, then you're right. Then we have a more fundamental bargaining problem on our hands because there is no bargaining space for a deal.
Thank you. I think the best way people should be reading the book because, as I said, those strategies are very, they're apt, and if they can be followed, they should be followed because those, as I said earlier, would contribute to obviating the assurance dilemma. But unfortunately, I think, look, when we study coercive diplomacy, so if a war starts, that means coercive diplomacy has failed. So between September 11 and October 7, 2001, the Americans tried to coerce the Taliban regime. But when coercion failed, war began. So I think there are two problems here. One is that the US, the Trump administration, thinks that brute force uh, can generate coercive effects, which it cannot, because brute force meant to obliterate a country is completely different to or from uh, you know using force as a threat to exact some coercive demands. And as you rightly said, Robert Pape has been doing some excellent work on the ineffectiveness of air power when it comes to coercing states, and so I think this is really important. Uh, One more thing that I would like to touch upon here is this. So entanglement is a very important issue that you highlight in theorize in your book, and I think the best case, because I've done also done some academic work on the South African nuclear program, particularly Reagan's policy toward South Africa. So Reagan was kind of pretty easy when it came to the nuclear power, nuclear reactors, and all those things for South Africa, but it was his inability to disentangle the demands and then um, control the very active anti-apartheid lobby in the US, which eventually won and vetoed Reagan, sorry, and was able to pass the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in 1986. So I think this entanglement issue, while it is problematic, I think there's a case to be made for using one of your counter strategies to disentangle the demand. But then when there's brute force and missiles being exchanged, those things could go out the window. um,
Sure.
so
Let me just comment briefly on your point about brute force. So of course it's a very good point that brute force and coercion are not the same thing. But the way I would say it is that if through the use of force you attempt to acquire or achieve the thing that you have demanded, then you are engaged in the use of brute force and not coercion. So if I threaten you, if I threaten to bomb a nuclear facility, lest you shutter the nuclear facility, stop enriching uranium at that nuclear facility, let's say. If I threaten to do so to try and get you to give it up or make a deal, then I'm engaged in coercion. But if I bomb the nuclear facility, then I have just destroyed by brute force the thing I was threatening. I took what I was demanding that you do, and instead of giving you a choice to do it yourself, I did it for you. So I imposed a brute force solution instead of engaged in coercion. That said, limited force can be part of a coercive strategy. If the purpose of the use of force is to threaten that there is more punishment to come, then the latent violence that hasn't been used is the threat. And we can still apply a coercive framework to try and understand it. Now, there's lots of trade-offs that would then come with that, which is that, well, using force to threaten that I will use force in the future might make it look like I am going to use force in the future. And so when one bomb falls, you are less likely to believe that I'm going to withhold future bombs, right? That's an assurance problem that you've introduced by starting the war. So again, a sort of assurance dilemma problem, but we could still use a coercive framework to try and understand the bargaining that is going on in a limited war. As we were just saying, though, if you go about your war with, from the jump, assassination,
yeah,
um, uh,
obliteration.
yeah, and especially and rhetoric and the explicit threats that say, we seek your annihilation, right? Then the target would be right to interpret that strategy as one of brute force regime change rather than any coercive demand that's being supported through limited violence with the threat of more violence to come, right? Uh, in any case, so that's an important kind of distinction about what brute force is versus coercion and how we can apply this framework to limited war as well. You were talking about South Africa and explicitly using it as a case of demonstrating why entangled demands matter. It is much more clearly, in my mind and in the book, a case of coercion failure due to entangled demands than it is anything about successful assurance. So in the minds of South African leaders, when you go to the archives, what you're referring to, it's very clear that they believe that the nuclear issue and the apartheid issue have been entangled together, meaning that they think that if they make any nuclear concessions, that they will not get any sanctions relief because they are unwilling to make concessions over their apartheid practices of racist domestic policy. And then there's this whole story of the 1980s that you referred to about how Congress overrides Ronald Reagan's veto to pass
Even
comprehensive
though he tried
apartheid.
to preempt, he imposed sanctions of his
Yes,
own. He tried to executive order.
precisely.
Yeah, but
Tried to ward off.
yeah,
Yeah. Um, uh, but instead, what happens at the end of the day is that South Africa concedes both issues in the early 90s, in the late 80s and early 90s. So the success of anti-apartheid advocacy and global organization um, uh, is it's amazing, and it's a really kind of wonderful story of transnational pressure over human to enforce a human rights norm,
but it's not a coercive success. It
but
can't
is
be
not a
counted as
coercive
US
success.
coercive success. Yeah,
Right. It's not and there's nothing in the case that says um, that successful disentanglement of these issues led to
yeah,
instead what you see, which is quite interesting, is that in the case when de Klerk decides that he's going to concede on the apartheid issue, that they need to figure out how to manage the nuclear issue because they have constructed weapons, and then so they uh, dismantle the weapons. They declare the highly enriched uranium, the weapons grade uranium, to international inspectors. And then there's this kind of wink nod, tacit coordination that the book is fascinated by, because another aspect of assurance is an information game over how
yeah.
much the coercer knows about what the target is conceding and how to avoid Malford Broadhead-Hammer's cheater's dilemma. Um, and there's a fascinating examples of how the IAEA and the NPT are structured to look forward and not back. So as long as they could account for all of the material and know that there wasn't a secret squirreled away bomb program somewhere in South Africa, then they could focus on that materials accountancy and not require South Africa to declare the past purpose of this material, which is to say, to require them to say in public that they had constructed nuclear weapons. They decide later on
Later, 91,
to admit
93.
that,
Yeah,
93.
93. Yeah,
In
and
any case, so I would just add though that, like, to put a nail on the head of the entanglement problem, is that it doesn't the logic is not that you should just pick one issue to coerce over. There could be there always it's not really up to the analyst certainly to decide what the issues are, and they are clearly multiple. In the case of Iran today, journalists are constantly listing just these issues. The main ones being Iran's nuclear intentions, ambitions, capabilities, its conventional missile capabilities, and its support for proxies in the region. And then sometimes we get this fourth one of human rights abuses, right? How it treats its own people and how the theocracy in Iran is a brutal dictatorship. So uh, uh, these issues are only entangled if what happens is the US Congress passes a piece of legislation that says we're coercing Iran over these four issues, and unless it concedes to all four of them, the punishments will remain. They're entangled because you cannot concede on the nuclear issue and then expect relief because you haven't conceded any other issues.
yeah,
So coercers benefit from disentangling issues, not by just saying, hey, we don't care about all the other stuff, we're only going to care about one issue, but by saying specifically which punishments apply to which issue. Can we bargain over this one? Because yes, there will be some relief, either from sanctions or meaningful reduction in the likelihood of violence in the future, whatever the case is. can the target point to the specific benefit that will accrue if they make this concession? Because, by the way, also, if they do, then we can unlock what other cooperation scholars have pointed out, which is this evolution of cooperation logic, that when you strike bargains over smaller issues, that they can slowly grow, right? We can build agreement upon agreement and learn to begin to trust each other and structure larger agreements upon smaller agreements. But none of that is possible. You can't even begin that if the only offer that's being made, either tacitly or officially by the coercer, is that you must concede everything or nothing. And that's when issues become entangled and the coercion is harder. Coercive bargains are harder to reach when everything is entangled with the same punishments.
So I have one comment and one last small question, short question. So the comment is, so you have done an excellent job of explaining why the JCPOA the JCPOA was reached, and then why it was reached. I think agreeing to the JCPOA was in and of itself an attempt to disentangle an issue. So since 1979, I've been arguing in my own writings and stuff that since 1979, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the US have defied Lord Palmerston's principle that there are no permanent enemies and friends, there are only interests are permanent. So since 1979, there have been at loggerheads, barring a few occasions, which you've also mentioned in the book, and which I believe Iran is now repenting. Um, so the JCPOA you did a good job of isolating and insulating the nuclear issue from the other issues that bedevil the US and Iran. And unfortunately, the first Trump administration again entangled those issues and said, oh, the JCPOA does not talk about ballistic missiles, it does not talk about Hezbollah, Hamas, and other groups. So I think ever since that the issues have re-entangled, we are in this mess, and the mess is becoming deeper by the day. So my last question is, like, coercion has got a lot. The lack of coercive success has got a lot to do with another very fascinating concept that again Thomas Schelling introduced to us, is that of brinkmanship. Like uh, coercers are enamored of brinkmanship, and they think that the other side will swerve, but this is hardly the case in reality. So I know it is a slightly different concept, but I think there's a case for us to discuss how these coercive failures are uh, compelling us to reimagine what brinkmanship is in today's world.
It's a great question. It's the subject of my next book. I've decided to study specifically nuclear brinkmanship, but the concept of brinkmanship in general, because everything we've been talking about is in the world of credibility calculations. What is the probability in my mind that you mean what you say, whether it's a threat or a promise? And that you will actually do what you say, it would either hurt me or reward me or whatever. Brinkmanship says, especially in the world of nuclear strategy, that let's imagine there is nothing that a coercer could possibly do to make you believe that they're willing to fight a nuclear war, because everybody is going to suffer and nobody can win a nuclear war. So in a world of mutually assured destruction, these strategies of trying to communicate that the threat to use nuclear weapons is credible should fail. And therefore, we have a problem. We need to figure out how states can still bargain and communicate over where their interests lie and how resolved they are over them. If only, again, to communicate successfully about how to avoid war. Where I can be tested and where I can't be tested. And so that's where the concept of brinkmanship comes in, to say that we might be able to replace this traditional calculation of credibility with that of risk. That we could compare who is more willing to risk nuclear war, who has more stomach to risk mutual disaster, in order to compare our level of resolve while we're negotiating. Just to give your listeners even more of the logic, Thomas Schelling was fond of the analogy of mountain climbers chained together at the edge of a cliff. So one cannot credibly threaten to push the other one off the cliff, because that would doom them both. So, but what can one climber do to the other instead to indicate that it is willing to risk more mutual disaster? Well, it can start walking towards the edge. It can stand on a smooth slope towards the edge. It can stand on one foot. He can start to dance on loose gravel, all things that communicate that I don't want to fall and I'm not going to jump, but I am willing to risk the chance that I will fall and pull us both to our doom. Um, where the book is picking up, and I'm not going to say a ton about it because it's not written yet, but where the book is picking up is that there's a lot of scholarship now in history of the nuclear age that shows that leaders don't really like to to dance on the loose gravel below their feet at the edge of a cliff. There's not a lot of examples of what Schelling talks about as actually engaging in risk manipulation. Instead, what we see in crises is that leaders like to try and check and recheck that they have tight control of their nuclear forces. They want to maintain control because they're worried about bad things happening. So the book is going to develop, better explanation for how brinkmanship and especially the perception of risk matters to the outcome of crises. And there's an article that you can read that is published now that I wrote with Rose McDermott that brings a psychological lens to this that says that Schelling's version of brinkmanship assumed away humans because it said that humans would never make this irrational calculation of jumping off the cliff. And we play around with bringing lots of literature from psychology in to kind of overlay the logic of brinkmanship and say that, well, actually, there are circumstances in which humans can predictably make irrational choices. And some of them are well associated with crises, especially nuclear crises. Just giving an example, compressed time horizons or decision-making time is associated with less careful, rational thought. So in a world where rapid decisions are being forced because either there's a crisis ongoing or, let's say, a future world in which these decisions have to be made much more rapidly because the weapon systems have been integrated with AI information processing, and it's a offense-defense relationship that rewards quick decision making. Well, then we're going to end up in a crisis bargaining environment in which irrational decision making might be more likely than not. And so you explain, the sources of leverage in a crisis through the logic of whether one leader or another might not make careful, rational calculations. Just to try and connect this back to, right? So the book and all this thinking is about nuclear strategy. But there is a way of thinking about brinkmanship logic in conventional conflict as well. In any use of force, like ongoing today between the United States and Iran, there are things that I cannot control as the party that is using force about what will happen next. If I'm Iran and I launch a weapon that, say, a missile with a, a CEP that's fairly large, I can't be entirely confident that it's going to hit what I think it's going to hit or what I've aimed it at. And so every time I launch a non-precision munition, I am accepting some risk that it is going to send the message that I did not intend, which is to say, destroy something, have an effect on the ground that might escalate the conflict further in a way that I didn't intend. Um, Now, that's less of a concern if I believe I'm engaged in an all-out war, and it's much more of a concern if, going back to earlier in our conversation, we're engaged in a limited conflict in which we're trying the messages we're sending about how resolved we are to carry on the war or to escalate the war. The other brinkmanship-like logic here, the risk that I can't control, is I don't know what the other side's going to do in response. So I can't control, I'm only in control of what I can do. I'm not in control of what the other side does. And so there's always a risk that when, say the United States or Israel starts the conflict, that Iran engages in a response that I had not prepared for. That seems to be a bit of what happened at the very beginning of this conflict, which is that Iranian retaliation against neighbors in the region was, either discounted, which is a common in the history of warfare, right? It's just assuming your enemy is weaker and less capable than you thought. Um, uh, Discounted in the sense that we didn't think Iran was resolved to fight a major regional war. That obviously was wrong. And completely discounted in the case of the Strait of Hormuz, which is totally weird because this was long well known, right? Um, but there are uh, real things that war reveals. It doesn't, it reveals relative power, as realists always say. It also reveals relative resolve. Um, uh, we Analysts of all stripes could have told you that Iran was going to try and close the Strait of Hormuz,
Yeah.
right, in a major war um, uh, against the United States. And uh, I would love to know the real story one day, like why the White House discounted this so much. It's more. It's quite likely a case that they might have just said, "Well, they're not capable of it," which was, of course, wrong. Um, so, so yes, that was discounted, but there are also real serious analysts that would have told you before the war that of course they'll try, but it won't have as big a global effect on, to cause quite such an oil shock,
Yeah, which is such a
the
bizarre
way that it
claim to
actually
make.
has.
Yeah.
So there was sort of discounting, and then this is what constructivists are always trying to get us to think about, and I think it's important that material power alone is not enough to think about what's going on here, because it's not just the case that that we, made a miscalculation about what Iran was capable of and what it was resolved to do. It's also the case that, like, we now live in a different world in which it has been demonstrated how much leverage Iran has over the Strait of Hormuz and what effect that can have on the global economy. The fact that we are now here means that Iran can make much more severe threats now to do it in the future. And it's more leverage than they even thought they had prior to the war. And so, of course, they're not going to try, not going to give that up very easily. And that's what we saw leading to the breakdown of the MOU. So, um, uh, we are now all less safe for having revealed that this world exists. And we're now trying to figure out, or some of us are trying to figure out, hopefully everybody in government is also trying to figure out, how to resolve a new status quo that is, of course, not violent, but that is acceptable to all parties given the power and interests that have been revealed. And my concern, I'll just put it, because I know I've gone on too long, Ali, but I'll put a finer point on the bottom line for me, because I'm a scholar of nuclear security and policy. I study non-proliferation, right? All of this, I am concerned, makes it just more likely, not less, that we will get a nuclear Iran in the future.
I do not disagree with you. I think if the US continues to uh, see brute force as the last and the first instrument of strategy, uh, I was at a conference back in the day, like 7 years ago. There was an Iranian policy wonk there, and he told somebody that yes, there's a fatwa, but the fatwa would neither the giver of the fatwa nor the situation will remain the same after 300 years. And there's a very good book, just it recently came out, authored by Sina Azodi, Iran and the Bomb. It talks about this very thing that not you can't coerce Iran by the use of brute force, and totally ignore its legitimate security and strategic interests. So thank you so much, Dr. Pauly, for giving us taking out time and having this wide-ranging discussion with us on your book on coercion and also the role of the use of force in global politics. I would like to end by saying from the article that you talked about with Ross McDermott that choice and chance coexist, and leaders always have choices. They can always choose to get down from the brink rather than playing games of brinkmanship day in day out. Thank you so much. On this note, I'd like to thank our viewers and look forward to more conversations like this going forward. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.